Last time we spoke about the harrowing accounts of Operation Seigo, the retaliation against the Doolittle raid that saw an estimated 250,000 Chinese killed. The IJN knocked out the airfields in Zhejiang and Jiangxi before they set to work, murdering, raping, and pillaging the region in an orgy of death and suffering. Yet for the past few weeks, we have been looking at Station Hypo and the cryptanalyst team under Joseph Rochefort, who were making a huge difference in the war effort. They had uncovered the word AF being Midway, and now Admiral Nimitz was willing to toss the kitchen sink against a much larger foe, hoping intelligence would prove the decisive edge needed to win one of the most legendary naval battles in history. Today, we're going to take a deep dive into one of the turning points of the Pacific War. This episode is the Battle of Midway. Welcome back to the Pacific War podcast week by week, and I'm your dutiful host, Craig Watson. But before I can begin, I just want to remind you, this podcast is only made possible through the efforts of Kings and Generals over at YouTube. Perhaps you want to learn a bit more about World War II? Kings and Generals has an assortment of episodes on World War II and much, much more, so go give them a look over at YouTube. So please, subscribe to Kings and Generals over at YouTube and continue to help us produce this content by checking out www.patreon.com/kingsandgenerals. And hey, if after all that you are still hungry for some more Pacific War content, why don't you check my personal channel out, the Pacific War channel over at YouTube, where I happen to have a specific episode on Nagumo's dilemma during the Battle of Midway. Give it a look, it'll mean a lot to me. Almost 6 months has passed since a devastating surprise attack on Pearl Harbor. The Japanese Empire for the last half year have won victory after victory after victory. Malaya, Singapore, Burma, the Philippines, the Dutch East Indies, New Britain, all fell, one by one, like dominoes. The Empire of the Rising Sun was at its zenith, but something was festering inside the empire. Something the Japanese would later call sensio byo, known in English as victory disease. Every victory in battle brought the Japanese military leaders more confidence, faith that Japan was invincible, that they could afford to treat their enemies with contempt. The symptoms of the disease were overconfidence, a failure to weigh risks properly, and a basic misunderstanding of the enemy. The IJN had tested the Allied strength in the Pacific and found it surprisingly feeble. So feeble that it seemed the deficiency could only be because the enemy lacked fighting spirit. Japan had scored so many easy victories in the war's early stages, and this came to no surprise to Admiral Yamamoto. In a typical passage in one of his pre-war letters, he predicted, "For a while, we'll have everything our own way, stretching out in every direction like an octopus spreading its tentacles. But it'll only last for a year and a half at the most." Now, the Doolittle raid greatly unnerved many in the military, such as Admiral Yamamoto. After the raid, Yamamoto took a newly high tone with the panderums of Tokyo. He said that Midway Island had probably been the base of the attack. Midway was the linchpin of the American threat to the homeland, he said, and if it was not taken quickly, forces committed to homeland defense would have to be greatly expanded at the expense of further offensives in the south. Opponents on the naval general staff and in the army hoped to kill the Midway operation using a series of delaying tactics. But after the Doolittle raid, their resistance, it crumbled. On April the 20th, at a meeting of the IJN and the IJA planners, it was agreed to postpone the attacks on New Caledonia, Samoa, and Fiji until after the Midway operation. Admiral Nagumo tossed his support behind Yamamoto. General Tanaka of the IJA, receiving assurances that the Midway operation would not be the first step in a planned invasion of Hawaii, also gave his consent to provide infantry regiments to the operation. Vital entails that had been previously withheld, such as dates, orders, the fleet units to be dispatched, and so forth were now shown. The Midway operation was to take place the first week of June, immediately after the return of major units from Operation MO, the failed invasion of Port Moresby. As I had mentioned in a previous episode, even before the Battle of Coral Sea, Joseph Rochefort of Station Hypo had suspected that the Japanese were planning another major operation in the Central Pacific, possibly aimed at Midway or maybe even Hawaii. In early May, Allied listening posts noted a major surge of radio traffic coming out of Saipan, but not a peep out of Truk, Japan's principal naval base in the South Pacific. That seemed to indicate a new offensive aimed directly across the Pacific, north of the equator, and not south. On May the 12th, Rochefort called Leighton. "I've got something so hot here, it's burning the top of my desk. You'll have to come over and see it. It's not cut and dried, but it's hot. The man with the blue eyes will want to know your opinion of it." The message he was talking about included a code group for Koryaku Butai, invasion force, and another phrase meaning forthcoming campaign, both linked to a geographical designator AF. As early as March, Rochefort postulated AF to be Midway. Midway, after all, was the only atoll large enough to support an air group. Others, such as Palmyra or Johnston Island, were thought to be far too small to be worth any major operations. By the simple process of elimination, Midway seemed to be the most likely candidate. Leighton agreed. "We knew that AH was Oahu, and that AK was probably the French frigate Shoals. Now that the base supplies for an air unit were being readied for the shipment into AF, with the occupational forces, it had to be one of our island bases within striking distance of Pearl Harbor. Midway was the obvious target, since it was nearly 150 miles nearer to the Japanese on Wake than the alternative, Johnston Island." All of the deductions were sound, but none of it would matter unless Admiral Nimitz was convinced. They had no ironclad proof AF was in fact Midway. Now Rochefort and Leighton had correctly foretold the Japanese invasion of Port Moresby, so they now enjoyed Singpak's full attention. In the month between Coral Sea and the Battle of Midway, Admiral Nimitz would be called upon to make the most high-stakes decision in his 40-year naval career, and he was willing to risk everything based on the best estimations of his intelligence advisors. Yet Nimitz was not the ultimate authority. Behind Admiral Nimitz loomed Admiral King, who was anxious not to lose any more of the Navy's few remaining aircraft carriers, and he was taking an active hand in choosing where and how to deploy them. Directly after the Battle of Coral Sea, King remained very uneasy about New Caledonia, Fiji, and other island groups straddling the US-Australia sea link. Rochefort and his team knew it had to be Midway, but to convince Nimitz to act, they required concrete evidence. Rochefort then had a great idea. He proposed a ruse. The local commander on Midway would be told to transmit, in plain language radio, a broadcast back to Pearl Harbor, reporting that Midway's desalination plant had broken down, and that as a result, the atoll was short of fresh water. And would you believe it? Soon, a radio broadcast passed from the Imperial General Headquarters in Tokyo to the IJN Combined Fleet alerted them AF was short on fresh water. That message, by the way, was intercepted and broken down by Station Hypo and a cryptanalyst unit based in Melbourne. The ruse was an enormous success. They had the evidence proving, once and for all, AF was in fact Midway. Thus, Admiral Nimitz and Admiral King both agreed to get the fleet together to stage a trap. On May the 5th, 2 days before the Battle of Coral Sea, orders for the Midway and Aleutians operation had been disseminated throughout the Japanese fleet. Order number 18, under the signature of Admiral Osami Nagano, instructed Admiral Yamamoto to carry out the occupation of Midway Island and key points in the Western Aleutians in cooperation with the Army. It was going to be the largest naval amphibious operation ever attempted in the history of naval warfare. It would split the Japanese forces into 5 large independent tactical groups, operating throughout the vast North Pacific battle zone, all the way from the frozen islands of the Aleutian archipelago to the atoll of Midway, 2,000 miles south. Nearly 200 IJN warships would participate in the operation, and more than 700 aircraft. The plan involved a complex, highly choreographed series of attacks which would have to be unfolded with exquisite timing and under strict radio silence. On June the 3rd, a northern force would launch an air raid on Dutch harbor of Unalaska Island, the chief U.S. airbase in the Aleutians. This would be followed up by an invasion of 3 outer Aleutian islands. At dawn on June the 4th, the IJN Carriers would launch airstrikes on the Midway Atoll from its northwest with the aim of destroying all of its aircraft on the ground, clearing the beaches for an invasion force, which would land on the atoll on the night of June the 5th. Once the atoll was secured, 2 construction battalions would land and begin upgrading and expanding its air facilities. Any American naval forces sallying out of Pearl Harbor to oppose the invasion would be set upon and destroyed. It was a giant mousetrap. The Midway operation was not a product of sound military planning. It was a farrago of compromises struck to quell internal dissent and to balance the demands of rivals in the combined fleet and the Naval General Staff. Unsurprisingly, it held many contradictions, flaws, and unnecessary risks. The plan spread Japanese forces too thinly over a huge expanse of the North Pacific, and relied on dubious conjectures about how the Americans would react. It asked far too much for a few elite aviators who had been flying and fighting almost without a break since December the 7th of 1941. The Japanese commanders were loath to admit it, but their most experienced carrier aircrews were fatigued, while the newcomers lacked training and seasoning to equal the skill of these veterans. Admiral Nagumo would observe that there had been considerable turnover in personnel. Inexperienced flyers barely got to the point where they could make daytime landings on carriers. It was found that even some of the more seasoned flyers had lost some of their skill. The Aleutians operation was just tacked on at the insistence of the Naval General Staff, and it bore no strategic relationship at all to the Midway operation. The forces were so far away that they would be incapable of coming to a timely support of the main fleet in the south. The Japanese could easily take the islands of Attu and Kiska without much opposition, but they were almost pointless to take. They held little value to either the Japanese or Americans. They lacked bases of support, and the occupiers were powerless to beat back any counterattacks. The Midway offensive seemed to be motivated a bit by the desire for the main Japanese surface fleet of battleships, who had spent the entire war just sitting at anchor at Hashirajima in Hiroshima Bay, to do something. There was even an insulting term, the Hashirajima Fleet, which had been making rounds amongst carrier task forces. The crews of those anchored ships were growing restless. Admiral Ugaki said, "The morale of the main body is stale after a long stay in home waters. I have encouraged them, but we must study methods of training afresh, and at the same time engage in some operational action." Now, with such a colossal armada, possessing superiority in both carrier and surface naval strength, why did Yamamoto not just concentrate his forces and crush the Americans? Why not just fight it out with the old battle by the numbers? Apart from the Aleutians add-on, it appears that the Midway Plan was an attempt to balance the Mahanian rule of concentration with the need to disguise the true scale of the Japanese offensive from the Americans. You see, Yamamoto's main purpose for the entire operation was to lure out the American carriers. If Admiral Nimitz should discover that nearly the entire Japanese Navy was hovering outside of Midway, he would simply keep his ships safe at port, even if it meant losing Midway. Yamamoto's intention was to keep the bulk of his forces safely beyond the range of Midway-based reconnaissance flights, so that an unsuspecting Admiral Nimitz would send the U.S. Pacific Fleet out to give battle. But in that case, could the widely dispersed Japanese forces get into action in time to make the decisive difference? Underlying the operation was a casual assumption that Japan was fated to continue its run of victories. Sensio Bio was at work. During the first week of May, Yamamoto and all the ranking officers of the fleet gathered on the battleship Yamato for a multi-day planning conference. There was a giant tabletop wargaming exercise with model ships placed on the maps of the North Pacific and throws of dice to signify the omnipresence of chance. Just gonna toss it out there. To this very day, I still play Axis and Allies. Nothing beats the old miniatures and dice, baby. The wargaming was done to scrutinize the plan and to shed light on any possible weaknesses. But it soon became clear that Yamamoto and his key staff officers had zero interest in scrutiny, much less any criticism. The real purpose was just to validate Yamamoto's plan. Yamamoto was an avid gambler, and he simply liked the odds. During one game on the second day, the U.S. carriers appeared on the Kido Butai's port flank and dealt a sudden and crippling air attack. The table judge ruled that the scenario was unbelievable, and he tossed away the results. He declared that the U.S. carriers could not get into battle until they had been alerted to Nagumo's presence by the first Japanese airstrike on Midway. In another game, the Midway-based land bombers counterattacked the Kido Butai, and the dice rolled 9 hits, knocking out Akagi and Kaiga. Admiral Ugaki, who was acting as chief judge that day, suddenly said, "Wait, we'll reduce the number of hits just to 3. Thus, because of his arbitrary revision, only Kaga was sunk. Then Admiral Ugaki arranged the resurrection of Kaga for the next stage of operations involving attacks against New Caledonia and Fiji. As Mitsuo Fuchida put it, this kind of supervision was enough to disgust even the most hardened flying officers amongst us." Yamamoto himself asked a foreshadowing question. What if the U.S. carriers suddenly appeared within striking range of the Kido Butai? Lieutenant Commander Minori Genda simply dismissed the threat, exclaiming, "Gaishe Ishaki!" One touch of the armored gauntlet. Basically what he was saying, we'll wipe them out. Given all the results of the wargaming, Yamamoto made one concession, and that was to instruct Nagumo to maintain a reserve strike on board the carriers after the Midway attack had been launched, just in case the U.S. carriers should appear. Now, the last time we had left off, Admiral Nimitz ordered Halsey and Task Force 16 to haul ass. See what I did there? To rush back to Pearl Harbor while making sure to be seen by the Japanese patrols, so that the Japanese would take the bait and continue with their Operation MI. He knew from Rochefort AF was Midway. It was 100% the target, but he did not know exactly when or what units would be employed. On May the 18th, Nimitz turned to Layton and Rochefort for answers. By May the 20th, Station Hypo received a long radio intercept, and it gave a ton of information. The IBM tabulators were working overtime, and the information held the complete battle orders for the Midway operation. This included a detailed description of the forces to be employed. By May the 27th, more decryptions figured out the IJN forces would be leaving from Saipan on May the 27th, and that June 6 would be an arrival date for a division of destroyers that would be protecting invasion transports. Rochefort and Layton pieced all the puzzle pieces together, and they met with Nimitz and several senior members of his staff. Rear Admiral Raymond Spruance was present, soon to be appointed commander of Task Force 16, because Admiral Halsey was suffering from a horrible case of psoriasis, probably brought on from intense stress. His skin was itching so bad he barely slept for days, and he was ordered to stand down for 6 weeks to recuperate. Rochefort forecast the carrier attack on Dutch Harbor to be dawn of June the 3rd, followed by another attack aimed at the Midway Atoll the next morning. The senior staff members were shocked by how specific the information was. Nimitz eventually asked Layton how the battle would unfold and to be specific. Layton said, "All right then, Admiral. I've previously given you the intelligence that the carriers will probably attack Midway on the morning of the 4th of June. So we'll pick the 4th of June for the day. They'll come in from the northwest on a bearing of 325 degrees, and they will be sighted at about 175 miles from Midway. And the time will be about 6 a.m. Midway time." That same afternoon, Nimitz issued Operation Plan 2942, which stated the Japanese would attempt the seizure of Midway. The Enterprise and Hornets Task Force 16 would proceed to Point Luck, a suitable codenamed area 350 miles northeast of the Midway Atoll. There they would rendezvous with Admiral Fletcher of Task Force 17, compromising the newly repaired USS Yorktown and her 8 escorts. The 3 carriers would lie in wait until the IJN Carriers were spotted by air reconnaissance, and then they would launch a surprise attack on Nagumo's flank. When Admiral Halsey reached Pearl Harbor and came face to face with Nimitz, the man looked terrible. Nimitz said, "His eyes were sunken. He had lost 20 pounds. His skin had erupted in scaly patches of red and white, later diagnosed as general dermatitis." Halsey had carried the burden of seagoing command far too long without a break, and Nimitz ordered him to a naval hospital. Halsey would miss the Battle of Midway confined to a hospital bed, with his body smeared in medical ointments. It was, as he later described it, "the most grievous disappointment of my career." His replacement, Rear Admiral Spruance, was held in high opinion by Halsey. Spruance was a black-shoe admiral, but he would retain Halsey's first-rate staff, as well as practiced in-carrier operations. Spruance and Halsey were as different as possible for 2 career naval officers. Spruance was soft-spoken, prudent, a listener, who distrusted rhetoric, and never strived for dramatic effect. He led through example, with a high level of confidence and competence. He never allowed excitement or emotion to influence his decisions. He hardly smiled, and he was not fond of Ernest King. He kept himself fit by hiking, and even while at sea, he would walk endlessly circuits along the deck of his flagship. He was described as cerebral. He was something of a naval intellectual, who read deeply into the art of war at sea. One naval doctor described meeting him. "Saluted a trim, perhaps underweight, average height officer. His face deeply tanned, strikingly calm, almost a poker face. He had extraordinarily piercing blue eyes that seemed to see and read your very thoughts. A true Spartan in every sense." Now the Yorktown, as you might recall from the Battle of Coral Sea, was smashed. She was ordered to make her way straight to Pearl Harbor as quickly as her condition allowed, and she crept to Pearl Harbor by May the 27th. The hole in her flight deck had been patched over so neatly that no one could have guessed by looking down on the ship from up above that she had been hit by a Japanese bomb. She was ordered to go directly to dry dock number 1, and Nimitz alongside other officers paid her a visit immediately. Slogging through knee-deep water, he scrutinized the damage and listened to the engineers. According to one of the many myths about the Battle of Midway, one of the engineers asked Nimitz for 3 months to repair the Yorktown, and Nimitz would reply, "You have 3 days." Of course, the truth was less cinematic. When Nimitz told the repair party that, quote, "We must have this ship back in 3 days," he had already been informed that this was the minimum time required to set her to sail again. The repair superintendent and a small team of engineers had actually been flown out to the carrier the day before her arrival and made their assessment before she even reached Pearl Harbor. No, the USS Yorktown did not require 3 months of repair work. A single month would have sufficed for a complete job. But patchwork for 3 days? She could be put out to sea again. Rather than repair each ruptured seam, the yard would simply weld a single enormous steel plate over her wounds. The yard put 1,400 men to work in shifts day and night using floodlights. Some men went sleepless for 48 hours. Hundreds of the ship's crew were pressed into service, going without relief or liberty. Jimmy Thatch, the man who would create the thatch weave that allowed Wildcats to take on Zero fighters, was given a squadron of F-4F Wildcats that had folded wings. Lieutenant Scott McCuskey, a veteran fighter pilot, remembered, "A profound feeling of doom. This whole situation looked desperate. Admiral Nimitz was throwing everything he had against the superior Japanese force approaching Midway Island, including the battle-damaged Yorktown. I had been shocked by the performance of the Zeros in the Coral Sea. They had flown around me like a swarm of bees." Over on the Hornet, there was Lieutenant Commander John C. Waldron, an older flyboy at 40 years of age, but he kept himself in superb physical condition. As noted by his peers, Waldron took care to convey confidence, to assure his men that they were the best torpedo squadron in the fleet, and even to guarantee that the squadron would score hits on Japanese carriers in the coming battle. But he also emphasized that they should arrange their personal affairs and write letters to their families, just in case some of us don't get back. Task Force 16 put to sea on the morning of May the 28th, turning northwest en route to Point Luck, 300 miles northeast of Nagumo's expected position at the dawn of June the 4th. On May the 27th, Nagumo's flagship, Akagi, had raised her signal yard to set sail, and the Kido Butai left Hashirajima for Midway. They were under strict radio silence. Nagumo was forced to rely on Kawanishi flying boats operating out of the Marshall Islands to perform reconnaissance of Pearl Harbor. But Nimitz had sent a destroyer and seaplane tender to prevent the Kawanishis from refueling at the French frigate shoals, forcing Yamamoto to cancel flights on May the 31st. Yamamoto's second source of intelligence was a picket line of submarines spread out between Oahu and Midway. But the 2 U.S. task forces left Pearl Harbor before the IJN submarines had even reached their assigned stations. Thus, the Japanese had no idea that the U.S. carriers were north of the equator, ready to pounce on them. On June the 3rd, more than 1,000 miles north of the Kido Butai, the light carriers Ryujo and Jonyo launched a pre-dawn strike against Dutch Harbor. The defenders knew they were coming and met the enemy planes with heavy anti-aircraft fire. But nonetheless, the Japanese bombers managed to inflict heavy damage on the port facilities and killed around 25 men. 4 days later, Japanese forces would storm the beaches of the remote fog-shrouded islands of Kiska and Attu against minimal resistance. June 3rd also marked the first direct encounter between U.S. aircraft and the Japanese fleet converging on Midway. Rear Admiral Azo Tanaka and his troop transport group approached Midway from the southwest. they had just passed under the far-ranging air search radius of the atoll. 9 B-17s, led by Lieutenant Colonel Walter Sweeney, launched from Midway at 12:40 p.m., heading west to attack the group. They found Tanaka's convoy at 4:23 p.m., and they dropped their 600-pound bombs from 8 and 12,000 feet. After 6 months of repeated failure of high-altitude bombing of ships at sea, they should have known it was a fruitless venture. The Japanese crews literally watched the bombs fall from high overhead and steered the ships to avoid them. Not a single bomb hit, each missed by more than a mile. Likewise, the convoy's destroyers tried to fire their anti-aircraft guns, but they could not reach the altitude of Sweeney's planes. So it was, in other words, a wet noodle fight, and Sweeney's force would return to Midway. Afterwards, 4 PBYs armed with torpedoes came upon Tanaka's group at 1:30 a.m. on the morning of the 4th. One torpedo struck the oil tanker Akibono Maru, killing a dozen sailors, but the oiler kept her course going east. The Americans' early actions indicated to the Japanese their presence was known, so on the 3rd of June, the Kido Butai raised its speed to 24 knots. They had an iron-strong cap, running circles overhead as always, just in case of any sudden air attacks. At first light of June the 4th, the Kido Butai edged apart in a box pattern, each carrier separating the others by several miles. Reconnaissance floatplanes took off by catapult from cruisers Chikuma and Tone, but the intermittent squalls and overcast would make it hard for any scouts to see anything at all. The plane crews were roused from their bunk beds at 2:30 a.m. as the planes were fueled and armed to hit land-based targets. As men got into their cockpits to test the engines, Mitsuo Fuchida recalled, "The sound of engines alternately hummed and then rose to a whining roar. The flight deck was soon a hell of ear-shattering noise." At 4:15 a.m., with the ships still creeping in darkness, the air crews heard the loudspeakers blast, "Airmen, line up!" The crews lined up and they were briefed by their squadron leaders. The 4 carriers of the Kido Butai turned into the wind as Nagumo gave the order, "Launch the air attack force." By 4:45 a.m., the Armada, 108 planes, 36 Vals, 36 Kates, and 36 Zeros wheeled around the fleet in a wide counterclockwise corkscrew pattern and droned away southeast at 125 knots. Midway was armed to the teeth and ready to receive the enemy. Radar discovered the incoming strike at 5:53 a.m. The air raid alarm rang out, though the atoll's defenders were already awake and at their stations. By 6:15 a.m., Midway had managed to get every serviceable aircraft up in the air, so none would be caught on the ground. One PBY search plane piloted by Lieutenant William Chase caught sight of the incoming armada and transmitted his report. "Many planes heading Midway, bearing 320 degrees, distance 150. Midway's anti-aircraft gun emplacements were well concealed under camouflage netting. As soon as the armada came into range, a wall of flak came up. Several Japanese bombers took heavy damage in the first minutes of action and went straight into the sea in a blaze of fire and smoke. The anti-aircraft fire was so thick, in volume, that many pilots reported it looked like a cylindrical wall in front of Midway. The Hiryu's action report would note, "Their weapons accuracy is excellent, and the anti-aircraft fire is intense." As impressive as all that was, what was not impressive was Midway's fighter defenses. Marine Fighting Squadron 221 was equipped with 20 obsolete Brewster Buffaloes, the exact same aircraft that were brutally massacred over the skies of Malaya by Zero fighters. There were only 4 Wildcats on the atoll, and in the aerial melee, the Zero fighters virtually annihilated all of Midway's fighters at the cost of not a single Zero in return. With no fighters left to oppose them, the carrier bombers lined up to make their attack runs, concentrating on the buildings, hangars, fuel drums, and ammunition dumps. The installations took heavy damage, and the power and gas lines across the eastern island were completely knocked out. The bombers did little damage to the anti-aircraft batteries, however. They avoided the runways because, hell, they thought they would be using those runways soon enough. Most of the defenders on the ground survived by taking cover in concrete dugouts. Thus, aside from the poor fighters, Midway was still intact. The Japanese lost 11 aircraft, and twice that number were damaged. 20 aviators were dead, or downed at sea. Several were injured. Those losses were not that bad. But consider this. If the Japanese were to make repeated strikes on the atoll, the cumulative losses would multiply, something that would greatly stress the Japanese admirals making decisions. Once rid of their bombs, the Japanese planes rendezvoused west of the islands and began their return flight to the carriers around 6:45 a.m. Lieutenant Jeichi Tominaga, the leader of the attack force, radioed back to Nagumo, advising for a second strike. Akage began cycling her cap, landing Zeros for refuel, and launching new ones to replace them. This was a task Nagumo hoped to complete before the first wave returned, so that the flight decks would be clear to recover the aircraft. Then, at 7 a.m., the first of several small groups of American aircraft from Midway began to approach the Kido Butai. I just want to take a moment here to stress something. Like any teacher would, I guess. These attacks were extremely ineffective, done bravely, but hopelessly. However, the continuous pace of these attacks had to be met by Zero cap, costing them fuel and ammunition. The turntable schedule for these Zero fighters having to come back to the carriers to be replaced was completely screwed up by all of this. Admiral Chester Nagumo was being tossed a twist of fate moment. In other words, what I am saying is, this began a chain of events that would climax nearly 3 hours later, causing a historic turning point for the entire Pacific War. The first group came in low, from the south, directed towards the IJN Carriers' bows. They were 6 naval TBF Avenger torpedo bombers, and 4 B-26 medium torpedo bombers from Midway. The Japanese ships raised their alarms, and a swarm of 30 Zeros came down blasting their 20mm guns. All but a single Avenger were tossed straight into the sea. Pilot Albert Ernest, the sole survivor, said of the Zero fighters, "There were so many of them, they were getting into each other's way. You couldn't help but be impressed by how maneuverable they were." The B-26s fared only a bit better because of their bigger armor build. Only 3 of them managed to launch their torpedoes, but the drops were made way too far away from their targets, allowing the carriers to easily evade them. One of the B-26s, most likely damaged to all hell, flew directly at Akagi's bridge. Admiral Nagumo and his staff, astounded by the suicidal run, ducked for cover, but at the very last second, the big twin-engine bomber veered off, missing the bridge of the flagship, narrowly, spilling over into the sea. Now, Admiral Yamamoto had ordered Nagumo to keep a reserve strike on board just in case enemy aircraft carriers should appear on Kido Butai's exposed port flank. But Nagumo had yet to receive any sighting reports, and, well, he didn't expect any. His reconnaissance planes had been buzzing around north and east for over 3 hours, and by this time, most were turning back. It was quite likely, in theory, these planes could sight enemy ships on their return flight. Thus, Nagumo had no reason to really believe U.S. carriers were in the vicinity. The B-26 that almost smashed directly into his bridge, however, did arouse him that Midway's Air Force needed to be put firmly out of action, lest another American pilot smashed into his bridge the next time around. The Kate torpedo planes of the second strike group were armed with torpedoes, and as you can imagine, that is used to hit other ships. But if Nagumo were to make a second strike against Midway, well, torpedoes were not very useful. They would need to be outfitted instead with Type 80 land bombs. At 7:15 a.m., Nagumo gave the order. Planes in second attack wave, stand by to carry out attack today. Re-equip yourselves with land bombs. And so all across the decks, the maintenance crews were running around removing torpedoes and attaching bombs to the bellies of aircraft. The entire task would take at least an hour and a half. No sooner than when the order was given, a Japanese search plane reported a contact. It was Tane's No. 4 float plane, flying 100 degrees from the Kido Butai. Its pilot, Petty Officer Hiroshi Amari, radioed at 7:28 a.m. Sighted what appears to be the enemy, composed of 10 ships, bearing 10 degrees, distance 240 miles from Midway. On course 150 degrees at 20 knots. The report mentioned no carriers. It was possible the pilot spotted a surface fleet force, which posed no immediate threat at that range. On the other hand, it was possible the pilot had stumbled across the outer screening vessels of a carrier task force. You can imagine Nagumo was beginning to sweat some bullets. Then, at 7:58 a.m., Amari reported that the enemy ships had changed course to 80 degrees, and a very anxious Nagumo shot back. Advise ship types. Certainly, the past 6 months of naval warfare, and particularly the Battle of Coral Sea, had given ample reason to distrust initial contact reports, as you can imagine. Nonetheless, Nagumo ordered the plane crews to cease rearming the reserve strike. If another report came in indicating U.S. carriers were within striking range, he needed those planes armed with anti-ship ordnance. Nagumo was hesitating while waiting for further information. Now, to suspend rearming was one thing, but to reverse the rearming and rush a reserve strike up the elevators to launch against unknown ships, well, that was another matter altogether. Nagumo did not choose to do the aggressive course of action, that being to send what he had available at hand immediately as piecemeals. Historians on both sides of this war have scrutinized this decision since the event unfolded. Of course, with hindsight, you are screaming at the man, "Oh my god, what are you doing? Launch what planes you got, and hit them now." Hell, he could have even set the Kates outfitted with land bombs to hit them too if he really needed to. But at 7:45 a.m. on June the 4th, Admiral Nagumo acted on the basis of what he knew. He knew that Midway's airfield posed a threat to the Kido Butai, and would continue to be a threat until knocked out of action. He knew Tomonaga's armada was inbound and dangerously low on fuel. They needed clear decks to land upon. He also knew, as of 7:40 a.m., he had around 14 Zeros flying cap, down from 31 earlier that morning. Those damn small groups of ineffective American aircraft had screwed up the timetable for recovering the Zeros. Most of them used up their fuel and ammunition, and were aboard the carrier's refitting. On the other side of the coin, he was being given inconclusive reports without ship types, and hell, it could be all a mistake. A month earlier, at the Battle of Coral Sea, the reports were terribly inaccurate. So based on what he knew and what he did not know, Nagumo chose to wait for more information before deranging his entire order of operations. Nagumo's 4 carrier decks were scarce resources, in high demand, and he could not launch and recover aircraft simultaneously. The flight elevators were bottlenecked. The time required to rearm the reserve strike on the hangar decks was bottlenecked. The need to cycle the cap was bottlenecked. Admiral Nagumo's entire naval career had led him to this very moment. He has faced criticism in the past for his failure to launch another wave during Pearl Harbor. Now he faced an almost identical situation. Would he fail to launch the much-needed wave against Midway. Try to picture the environment also. Admiral Nagumo is surrounded by his officers on Akagi's very cramped bridge. Many of them are scouring over chart tables, surrounded by lockers and pedestal-mounted binoculars. It was squeezy in there. There was no privacy. The Admiral most likely could barely hear himself think. It's not like he could just step out to get a breath and think it over. So what do you think you would be like in this situation? Would your nerves hold up? At 7:53 a.m., the Japanese lookout spotted a group of 16 SBDs. This was the Midway-based U.S. Marine Squadron VMSB 241, led by Major Lofton Henderson. Most of Henderson's flyboys had not seen the inside of an SBD until a week prior. None had trained in dive-bombing tactics, so Henderson took them down from 9,500 feet into a shallow dive. They courageously flew through heavy anti-aircraft flak as Zero fighters swooped down behind them, cutting them to pieces. The SBD's bombs narrowly missed the Hiryu, causing large waterspouts to gush up. Zero fighters chased after the retreating SBDs, shooting down several. 9 SBDs survived the fleeing scene. Just as the surviving SBDs were making their getaway, 14 B-17s, led by Lieutenant Colonel Sweeney, soared overhead at 20,000 feet. They had been en route to hit the transport convoy in the west again, but were suddenly instructed to turn east and to attack the Kido Butai. Lieutenant Commander Ayazowo Fujita took his Zero into a steep climb to try and intercept the B-17s. Their flying altitude was much too high for me. The Zero pilot was not alone. The Japanese anti-aircraft gun teams could not reach the B-17s either. The B-17s, completely unmolested, dropped their payloads trying to hit the carrier Soryu. Their aim was a bit better than the previous day, because several bombs almost hit the ship. As Lieutenant Hiroshi Suzuki recalled, watching from Akagi, "Geysers of water engulfed the Soryu, and since I couldn't see the carrier, I thought it must have been hit very badly. However, after the water went back down, it looked like the ship was okay." The B-17s made their getaway as 11 SB-2U Vindicator scout bombers showed up to the scene targeting battleship Haruna. 3 of them were shot down as they missed their target, adding to the disappointment of the day. Then at 8:24 a.m., the periscope of a U.S. submarine, the Nautilus, peeked up through the water right dab in the middle of the entire Japanese fleet. She was sighted immediately by several Japanese ships who freaked out, sounding the alarm on the short-range radios. A destroyer rushed to the scene, tossing depth charges at her, as some Zeros even tried to strafe at her. The Nautilus crash-dived for her life, and thus far the Kido Butai seemed to have brushed off an onslaught. Not a single American bomb or torpedo had even scratched any of the Kido Butai. As Fuchida put it, "It was my judgment that the enemy flyers were not displaying a very high level of ability." And this evaluation was shared by Admiral Nagumo and his staff. "It was our general conclusion that we had little to fear from the enemy's offensive tactics." During the chaotic attacks, the Kido Butai had to cycle their cap, and that was not at all easy, with the carriers wheeling around to dodge the Americans. None of the returning planes had much fuel left. Some were even damaged. Some had injured men in them. To allow them to land safely, the carrier had to steam into the wind for at least 15 minutes, with another 30 minutes required to move the aircraft down to the hangar decks. Then at 8:20 a.m., that reconnaissance plane from the Tone, it reported, "The enemy is accompanied by what appears to be a carrier in the position to the rear of the others." For the past 6 months, it was the Kido Butai dictating events, forcing the enemy to react, inflicting heavy punishment upon them, and then withdrawing before any real retaliation could be dealt back. Sure, there had been some intense moments in the Indian Ocean, But this was quite a new experience. For the first time, the renowned Kido Butai was reacting to events dictated by a foe. The cardinal rule of carrier warfare, the one above all else, was to strike first. But Tominaga's armada had been orbiting patiently, their engines running on fumes, waiting for their opportunity to land on the carriers. Japanese carrier doctrine did not allow for one group of aircraft to be warmed up forward of the crash barriers while another group was recovered. Nagumo faced a horrible decision, or better called a dilemma. Nagumo's dilemma, as it is known today. By the way, I have an episode dedicated to Nagumo's dilemma over at the Pacific War channel at YouTube. Sorry, I had to throw that one out there. Nagumo had to choose between two not very great choices. Choice number 1. Nagumo could order Tominaga's entire armada strike to make a water landing. That meaning ditching at sea, while his reserve strike could be ready to launch around 9:15 a.m. This would involve the certain loss of many aircraft circling the Kido Butai and a lot of deaths. Choice number 2 was to recover Tominaga's armada, move them to the hangar decks, and his reserve strike would be ready to launch around 10 a.m. Well, hearing all of that, as you can all assume, Nagumo went with choice number 2. With any luck, the Kido Butai might have peace for the next hour and a half and strike at the enemy. Below in the hangar decks, the maintenance crews worked their asses off, rearming the reserve strike as fast as possible. Then they received Nagumo's order to switch the ordnance back to anti-ship types. Petty Officer Kaname Shimoyama, aboard Akagi, recalled, "There was utter confusion on Akagi. Inside our hangar, there was very little room, and it was very hard to do this job. Our torpedoes were also very heavy, and they were manually loaded onto our aircraft. In general, there were 2 groups of men. One group worked on the torpedoes, while the other group had the specific job of loading the torpedoes on the aircraft. When I looked at all of this confusion, even though I was a low-ranking person, I thought, is it really wise to be doing all of this?" Over on the Kaga, Ensign Maeda recalled the loudspeakers ordering, "Speed up the loading of the torpedoes." But all of this was very intricate work, requiring to be done with care. To rush the job, the bombs were removed from the aircraft and stored in racks on the hangar deck rather than lowered back into the magazines on hoists. This was quite a dangerous thing to do. If any bombs were to hit those decks, it would set off a chain of explosions. At 8:45 a.m., the reconnaissance plane made yet again another report. "Sight what appears to be 2 additional enemy cruisers in position bearing 8 degrees, distance 250 miles from Midway." Amari's plane was looking at the edges of a second U.S. carrier group. It was Task Force 16. Nagumo did not immediately realize it, but these fragmentary reports were pointing to the presence of 2 carrier task forces, both within striking range. Amari was low on fuel, but he was ordered to remain stationed above the U.S. fleets to gather more intel about its composition. At 8:55, Amari gave another update. He cited 10 American torpedo bombers heading in the direction of the Kido Butai. On June the 3rd, the 2 American carrier task forces received word of the attack on Dutch Harbor, and the crews knew they would be facing 4 to 5 Japanese carriers, while they were just 3. Lieutenant Commander Waldron gave his final briefing. "The approaching battle will be the biggest of the war, and may well be the turning point also. It is to be known as the Battle of Midway. It will be a historic and, I hope, glorious event. We have had a very short time to train, and we have worked under the most severe difficulties. But we have truly done the best humanly possible. I actually believe that under these conditions, we are the best in the world. My greatest hope is that we encounter a favorable tactical situation, but if we don't, and worse comes to worse, I want each one of us to do his utmost to destroy our enemies. If there is only one plane left to make a final run in, I want that man to go in and get a hit. May God be with us all. Good luck, happy landings, and give 'em hell. The pilots were shaken awake and sent to their flight quarters at 3 a.m. They got in their flight suits and they had breakfast in the mess hall. Steak and eggs. Better than the usual fare that they were used to. One airman quipped, "It's a feast for the condemned men." Before the first light, the Wildcats of the Cap took off, and 10 scout bombers were sent from Yorktown to fly search patterns to the north. The main airstrike was kept on deck. Admiral Fletcher decided to close the distance and wait for a definite sighting of the enemy before sending any attack waves. At 5:45 a.m., the task forces received word that Midway-based PBY Catalinas sighted a small armada of Japanese aircraft closing in on the atoll from the northeast. Enterprise and Hornet's loudspeakers blared, "Pilots, man your planes!" The morning was beautiful, accompanied by a cool breeze. Visibility was superb. Task Force 16 turned southeast right into the wind. The Enterprise began to put out 10 Wildcats to fly Cap, and 22 SPD dive bombers to sortie against the enemy. As this was occurring, the Americans intercepted Tonei's reconnaissance plane message to the Kido Butai, revealing the enemy now was aware of their presence. Spruance chose to throw doctrine away, and he sent the SPDs off without even waiting for the rest of the strike wave to get into the air. The Enterprise signaled Lieutenant Commander Clarence Mac McCluskey, the air group leader, "Proceed on mission assigned." The dive bombers got into a single large formation of bombing 6 and scouting 6. It was 33 planes in all, sending at a heading of 231 degrees, where the enemy was expected to be 142 miles away. Being dive bombers, they took a cruising altitude of 20,000 feet. Hornet's launch went much more smoothly, and the entire air group, led by Commander Stanhope Ring, got up by 7:40 a.m. 99 aircraft took a heading of 240 degrees, though later historical evidence seems to indicate they actually were about 265 degrees, leading them north of the Japanese position. Only one of Hornet's squadrons managed to find the enemy that day, Torpedo 8. Yorktown had departed from her sister carriers, recovering aircraft scouts around Point Option, a distance to the northeast. The diversion took her out of the striking range of the enemy, and she had to steam southwest at 25 knots to rejoin the Task Force 16. As a result, Fletcher would be late to launch his own planes, well after Enterprise and Hornet's waves were already well on their way to the enemy. Yorktown launched 35 aircraft, 65 Wildcats, 17 SPDs, and 12 Devastators, flying at 240 degrees to a distance of 150 miles. For better or worse, the American Armada was on its way. In comparison with the Japanese, it took Lieutenant Tomonaga's 108 aircraft armada only 15 minutes to get up in the air from 4 carriers, something simply beyond the American capabilities at this time. The Hornet and Enterprise took a full hour to get into the air and ready. The formations did not all fly together, nor in the same direction. Each air group took a different course according to their leader's independent navigation. To confuse matters even worse, none of the groups managed to stay together. Some showed up in small splintered formations, some never even found the enemy. They came in piecemeals, something Japanese doctrine did not allow for. It was a clusterfuck. It was such a mess that would turn out to be one of the most important factors that won the battle. Hornet's SPDs were strained by the weight of their 1,500-pound bombs. The 15 Devastators of Waldron's Torpedo 8 cruised at 1,500 feet, carrying their really heavy Mark 13 torpedoes. Waldron had disagreed with the airwave leader. Ring's navigational solutions and he urged him to turn south, heading 240 degrees. Ring, perhaps, refused the request or failed to copy the transmission. No one actually knows. There was no action report from Ring afterwards. But Waldron banked to port to follow his own nose to find the enemy. Waldron's squadron flew for about 100 miles, and at 9:15 a.m., they began to see the figures of Japanese ships. The Japanese lookouts knew immediately, based on their altitude, that they were torpedo planes. Zero fighters closed in from overhead behind the sluggish devastators. Waldron bravely led his squadron directly towards the Japanese. Their obsolete planes flying in a tiny group of 8 at an overwhelming enemy was suicidal. Many have likened it to the charge of the Light Brigade in the Crimean War. The Zeros fired their 20mm cannon salvos, punching holes into the cockpits, fuselages, and wings of the devastators. One by one, they caught fire, broke apart, blew up, and cartwheeled right into the sea. Waldron's plane was the first struck, right in the fuel tank. He burst into flames. Ensign Gay, oof, that name. Well, he said, "The Zeros that day caught us off balance. We were at a disadvantage all around." Gay's plane was hit several times as he launched his torpedo 800 yards from Soryu. His aircraft headed just over Soryu as he dropped over its other side, flying really low on his retreat. Then the Zeros chased after him. He recalled, "They shot my rudder controls and my ailerons out, and I pancaked right into the ocean. The hood slammed shut. I couldn't keep the right wing up. It had hit the water first and snapped the plane in. It bent all up, and it broke it up. And I had a sprained fuselage. Couldn't hardly get it open. That's when I got scared. I was afraid I was going to drown in this plane." Gay managed to get out of his Devastator onto its remaining wing, clutching a rubber life raft and a seat cushion. He tried to pull his rear gunner out of the back seat, but he couldn't get the man out before the sea took him. Gay was dropped into the water, and he concealed himself the best way he could by using the seat cushion. Soon the Japanese lookout spotted more incoming enemies. Torpedo 6 of Enterprise, led by Lieutenant Commander Eugene Lindsay, took his squadron into the outer circumference of the IJN fleet. They separated into 2 divisions and advanced on the bows of the nearest carrier, the Kaga. All 4 carriers turned in unison to starboard, presenting their sterns. It was a centuries-old naval adage, "A stern chase is a long chase," as they used to say. To execute an anvil attack on the fleeing carriers, it was not enough just to catch them. The Devastators had to overtake the carrier, loop around them, and approach both bows simultaneously. This was a suicidal chase, but the VT-6 would have an easier time than the unfortunate VT-8, for 2 reasons. Number 1, the Zeros had bunched up on the northern perimeter of the fleet where they had attacked the previous VT-8, and they would have to jet over 30 miles south to intercept them. Number 2, many of the Zeros had already expended their 20mm ammunition, taking out VT-8. 2 Devastators managed to drop torpedoes successfully, but they were easily dodged by the Kaga. Lindsay took his squadron directly into a group of 9 Zero fighters that swooped down, taking out 4 of his aircraft, including Lindsay himself. 5 of VT-6 survived the retreat, with 4 landing back safely on Enterprise and 1 having to ditch at sea. The Japanese had been hit since 7 a.m. by 6 different types of American aircraft. The Japanese did not know it at the time, but they were being attacked by airmen representing 3 branches of the U.S. services, Army, Navy, and the Marines. The Japanese had witnessed level bombing, glide bombing, torpedo bombing, and got a glimpse of the Grumman TBF Avenger, though the new torpedo plane's combat debut was not very impressive. Not a single Japanese ship had yet been even scratched, and the Zeros had shot down a ton of U.S. aircraft while losing basically no planes in return. Even so, by interrupting flight operations and forcing rapid cycles for the cap, the constant pressure of the American air attacks kept the Kido Butai on its back foot. With another 20 minutes, the first bombers would be lifted up the elevators and moved onto the flight decks, if those flight decks could be kept clear for another 45 minutes, until around 11 a.m. Until then, The carriers would remain in a terribly vulnerable position of having their attack planes fueling and rearming on those said hangar decks. What worried Admiral Nagumo and his fellow officers the most was that the Kido Butai had yet to be subjected to a proper dive bombing attack. They all knew the SPD Dauntless dive bomber was the most lethal aircraft in the American inventory. They saw this during the Battle of Coral Sea just a month earlier. It had maimed Shokaku and annihilated Shoho. 32 SPDs from Enterprise of Scouting 6, led by Lieutenant Wilmer Earl Gallagher. Bombing 6, led by Lieutenant Richard Halsey Best, and Air Group Leader Lieutenant Commander McCluskey, surmised they had passed the line of Nagumo's advance on Midway. McCluskey figured the enemy had to be northwest, so they pulled a right turn, and a half hour later, there was still no sign of the IJN. Fuel was running low. The risk of having to ditch was ever growing. Then shortly before 10 a.m., the squadrons turned again to the east, and at 5 minutes to 10, McCluskey spied a destroyer. It was the Adashia. She was just due south of the Kido Butai. She had gone off to chase and death charge the U.S. submarine Nautilus. McCluskey turned to follow her line of advance, and 5 minutes later, they spotted more Japanese ships. The Adashia had led them right to the Kido Butai. Clarence Dickinson would later write of the sight. Thin, white lines, mere threads, chalk white. Among those ships, I could see two long, narrow, yellow rectangles, the flight decks of carriers. Apparently they leave the decks either the natural wood color, or possibly they paint them a light yellow. But that yellow stood out on the dark blue sea like nothing you have ever seen. Then further off I saw a third carrier. Each flight deck was marked with a red Hinomaru, the red rising sun. Dickinson would make a mental note to use the red dot as a bullseye. McCluskey radioed Enterprise. "This is McCluskey. Have sighted the enemy." He did not fly towards the carriers, and instead led the 32 aircraft in a long detour around the enemy fleet to the northeast. He intended to attack them with the sun behind their backs, hoping to conceal their approach and spoil the aim of the anti-aircraft gunners. He nosed down to pick up speed, and the rest of the formation followed his lead. They flew directly over several screening destroyers, but none of the Japanese lookouts even raised an alarm. Probably because they were distracted by the third wave of incoming torpedo planes bearing down on the Kido Butai from the southeast nearly 15,000 feet below. That group was 12 aircraft of VT-3 of Yorktown, led by Lieutenant Commander Lance Macy, escorted by 6 Wildcats led by Lieutenant Commander Jimmy Thatch. The same Thatch who had developed a group formation which would later be known as the Thatch Weave to take down Zero fighters. It was to be the first time the Thatch Weave would be put into practice during the Pacific War, a nasty surprise for the veteran Zero pilots. The technique involved 2 wingmen who would wait until the Zero was on one's beam of firing. Usually, the more maneuverable Zero would just veer out of the beam with ease, but during the Thatch Weave, 2 wingmen would perform a weaving pattern, forming 2 parallel beams. Thus, the idea was simple. If the Zero veered left or right, one of the Wildcats was still going to hit him. Thatch's 6 Wildcats flew 2,000 feet above Macy's Devastators, and they were set upon by 15 Zero fighters. Thatch recalled thinking to himself, all of them were going to die. But the Thatch Weave caught many Zero pilots off balance, and for the first time in battle, Zeros were shot down. Thatch wrote later on, "A number of them coming down in a string on our fighters. The air was just like a beehive. It didn't look like my weave was working, but then it began to. I got a good shot at 2 of them and burned them. One had made a pass at my wingman, pulled out to the right, and then came back. We were weaving continuously, and I got a head-on shot at him. Meanwhile, Macy's Devastators rushed at Hiryu, the closest out of the 4 carriers. Despite Thatch's gallant efforts, not all the Zeros would be pulled off of VT-3. A dozen Zeros swarmed onto the Devastators, sending them to a watery grave, one by one. VT-3 scored 0 hits and lost 12 aircraft. Thatch said later on, "That first attack on us and the torpedo planes was beautifully coordinated. It was something I had to admire. It was beautifully executed. This was their first team, and they were pros." Far above was Enterprise's dive-bombing squadrons, nearing their pushover points. McCluskey did not realize it, but 17 SBDs of Yorktown's Bombing 3 had just arrived to the scene at the exact same time from a completely different direction, that being east. The Japanese fleet was caught between two large waves of enemy dive bombers, and they were utterly unprepared to repel both attacks. No Zero fighters were at high enough altitude, having descended to hit Macy's torpedo planes. The 4 carriers of the Kido Butai had been maneuvering to avoid attacks for over an hour, and they had deranged their favorite box formation, and now they were strung out in a ragged line, spreading the Zero cap over a longer axis. This also diluted the concentration of anti-aircraft fire. McCluskey's division nosed up in a stalled position, opened their flaps, and peeled off to one side, diving steeply at a 70-degree angle. They centered their optical bomb sights on the flight decks of their chosen targets, and it was 10:20 a.m. Enterprise's planes dived on Kaiga and Akagi, while Commander Maxwell Leslie of Yorktown took his flyboys to attack Soryu. Lieutenant Dixon recalled, "I was making the best dive I'd ever made. The people who came back said it was the best dive they had ever made too. We were coming from all directions, on the port side of the carrier, beautifully spaced out." Kaga was going 28 knots as her crewmen cheered the Zero fighters, cutting down the torpedo planes to pieces. The anti-aircraft gunners had depressed their weapons to a horizontal motion to fight off the low-altitude devastators. Then, one of Kaga's pilots, standing on the catwalk, recalled, "One of our machine gun commanders pointed his baton to the sky and shouted something. When I looked up, several dive bombers appeared between the clouds and they were plunging down at us. Several voices shouted, 'Enemy dive bombers!'" Kaga's captain, Jisaku Okada, ordered a hard starboard, sending the carrier into a clockwise turn, but the SBDs corrected their flight paths to keep up. The Japanese crew watched in horror as the bombs separated from the bellies of the aircraft and descended upon them. The first 3 narrowly missed, tossing up huge geysers of water on either side of Kaga. Then the next 3 smashed inward in quick succession, 2 amidship and 2 forward. The result was cataclysmic. The carrier's superstructure was annihilated, killing most of the ranking officers, including Captain Okada. The island's windows blew out, its outer skin stripped off, and its interior spaces were flooded with smoke, driving men to flee onto the decks. The forward elevator took a direct hit, with the bomb smashing downward right through it. A bomb pierced the flight deck amidship, exploding in the crew's quarters, killing hundreds of men in just a few seconds. Fuel tanks and munitions detonated all over the hangar deck. Ensign Maeda jumped for cover under the flight deck near the stern as the bombs struck. He shouted to his comrades, "It's dangerous here! Get the hell out!" As Maeda climbed the ladders, he noticed the ship was listing. Then an explosion flung him to the deck and his leg was hit with shrapnel. Lieutenant Dixon's bomb had hit the elevator, and he could see. The deck rippled and curled back in all directions, exposing a great section of the hangar below. I knew the last plane had taken off or landed on that carrier for a long time to come. Thatch, watching the scene from high above, recalled, "I remember looking at the height of the flames from the ship and noticing that it was the same as the length of the ship. Just solid flame going up, and of course, there was a lot of smoke on top of that." Carrier Soryu began to turn into the wind, trying to launch more Zeros. As her crew was watching the still developing attack of the torpedo planes, then suddenly lookouts shouted that Kaga was under attack. Heads turned and watched in horror as Kaga's flight deck erupted in chains of explosion. The smoke rose up, concealing the approach of Leslie's Yorktown dive-bombing group. One by one, they began to emerge as the anti-aircraft gunners cranked up, frantically trying to fire upon them. The Soryu swung hard to port, but the SPDs turned with her. The first bomb struck right into her starboard side, forward, causing the ship's entire hull to lunge violently to port. Another bomb smashed dead center amidship on the flight deck, and it passed right through the wood and steel skin to detonate neatly in the middle of a hangar deck. A third struck her aft on the flight deck, blinding most of her crew, who were not instantly killed or blown overboard by the blast. Soryu's engines cut out as she went dead in the water, with smoke rising out of her gashing wounds. Burning Zeros, and corpses and body parts were strung out all across her deck. Nagumo's flagship, the Akagi, nearly escaped the attention of the American dive bombers. McCluskey's entire 32-plane armada had almost entirely concentrated their bombs on Kaga, while leaving Akagi all alone. But Lieutenant Dick Best, leading VB-6, saw that this was occurring, and he led his two wingmen to attack Akagi. Lieutenant Best's dive angle was shallower than the Kaga attackers, placing the three planes of VB-6 at a very dangerous approach. They maintained their flying V formation throughout the dive against textbook doctrine. Lookouts aboard Akagi shouted an alarm, but the anti-aircraft guns were very slow to respond. A few crewmen flung themselves flat on the deck. Captain Tajiro Oyoki made a hard starboard turn, but that turned the flagship's port beam directly towards their attacks. The first bomb smashed Akagi near the very center of her flight deck. The 1,000-pound bomb, dropped by Best, hit the middle elevator. Had it missed, it would have most likely changed the course of the entire battle. But it did hit, and it penetrated through Akagi's flight deck to her upper hangar deck, where it exploded, and this was amplified and multiplied by numerous secondary explosions amongst the fueled-up strike planes, fuel in the lines, and hastily stored bombs and torpedoes. Fuchida saw the event. A huge hole in the flight deck, just behind the amidships elevator. The elevator itself, twisted like molten glass, was drooping into the hangar. Deck plates reeled upward in grotesque configurations. Planes stood tail up, belching livid flame and jet-black smoke. Kadame Shimoyama was aboard Akagi's hangar deck, and he witnessed the devastating explosions up close and personal. It all happened so quickly. The hangar was very dark, but engulfed in a sea of fire. I thought that our carrier would sink at any moment. I saw some men who could not keep their composure, and they lost all self-control. They just went crazy and tried to escape. Hiroshi Suzuki was around the parked Zero fighters, and he saw their 20mm guns ignite and begin going off. Due to the intense heat, the rivets from the steel plates started to pop out like they were bullets. One of my classmates was wounded because he was hit by some of the lethal rivets flying through the air. A third bomb hit Akagi's stern, detonating and wrenching the flight deck up and jamming her rudder at 20 degrees to port, forcing the wounded flagship to travel helplessly in a wide turn until she came to a stop. Tom Cheek, in Thatch's squadron, saw some of the scene unfold. Kaga, Soryu, and Akagi ablaze. A brilliant orange flash on Akagi's deck, followed by water spouts. A few seconds later came a rolling, greenish-yellow ball of flame that seemed to open the bowels of the ship. Then there was a series of explosions that seemed to envelop the full length of Kaga's flight deck, which erupted with bomb bursts and flames. Soryu was pouring a column of black smoke. Each carrier lost their propulsion. By 10:26 a.m., the three carriers had suffered tremendous blows. None would ever land or launch a plane ever again. As the three carriers burned like Viking funeral ships, the American air groups fled the scene as vengeful Zero fighters and anti-aircraft gunners tried to fire upon them. Many escaped to safety. The air groups were spread all over the sky, alone or in small groups. Some pilots had been shot or were hit by shrapnel, bleeding into their flight suits. A lot of them were low on fuel and did not have enough left to reach home. Many would have to ditch at sea. Lieutenant Dickinson saw his fuel gauge bounce on 0 as his engine began to sputter and miss. He unbuckled his parachute, cleared his harness, disconnected the radio cord from his helmet, and cleared all the gear that could get in his way as he tried to exit his cockpit. He turned into the wind, put down his flaps, and dropped to a few feet above the wave tops. He nosed up, gave the engine a last burst of throttle, and chopped right into it. The impact was violent. Dickinson had seconds to unbuckle his safety belt and climb out of the cockpit. He stood up on his right wing, and he pulled out his CO2 cylinder and inflated his life jacket. His co-pilot climbed up onto the other wing, and they would both be picked up in short order by a friendly destroyer. The pilots who landed back on their carriers were met by crews anxious to learn about what had occurred. Although the loudspeaker systems had provided regular updates the entire time, in truth, no one, not even Admiral Fletcher or Spruance, knew precisely how the battle had unfolded. Far too much was happening all at once. The data was hard to piece together. Survival was bittersweet for the returning aviators, many of whom lost friends during the fight. Ensign Fisher of Hornet's VB-8 learnt upon landing he was the only pilot to have returned by that point, though shortly after more would return. For the 15 Devastators of VT-8 and the 10 Wildcats of VF-8, none would return. All crew declared MIA. The surviving pilots of the 3 carriers rushed for coffee and sandwiches as they spoke excitedly about what they had seen and done. It became very apparent to all the crews that a devastating blow had been made against the Japanese. As hours dragged on and none of Hornet's Devastators appeared, the mood on the carrier grew much darker. Many would learn later that day that Hornet's Devastators were massacred, and many of her Wildcat escorts had to ditch at sea. Her SPDs failed to even find the enemy, and most survived by either landing on the Midway Atoll or returning to the carrier. In total, Hornet lost all of her Devastators. A third of her Wildcats and a third of her SPDs were on Midway. Excluding Waldron and his squadron, which scored no hits, no Hornet aircraft even engaged the enemy. Back over at the 3 blazing Japanese carriers, while their crews were fighting a life-and-death struggle against the fires, the Japanese Navy, with its overemphasis on offensive warfare, had neglected to train and properly prepare adequate firefighting and damage control operations. The interior of the ships held numerous flammable substances, from wood flooring and furniture to cotton bedding, fuel, and loose bombs and torpedoes that had not already exploded. Fire hoses sprayed foam everywhere. The Kaga, which had taken 4 or possibly 5 hits, was in the worst shape of them all. Her hangar was a maelstrom of fire, touching bombs and torpedoes on the planes and in the storage rooms. Mutilated bodies were scattered all over her deck. Smoke filled the enclosed spaces and the lights all cut out. The fuel mains ruptured, pouring aviation gas into the fires, spreading the blazing inferno everywhere. Kaga's fires spread so rapidly, they overwhelmed her damage control efforts. Many men who had been drilled in firefighting were killed and wounded. Lieutenant Takayoshi Morinaga, a Kate torpedo pilot, recalled trying to put out fires with the old-fashioned bucket of water method. The water evaporated quickly. It was useless. On Soyu, the situation was similar. Secondary explosions in the hangar decks overwhelmed the damage control teams. There was a tremendous explosion in the engine room, trapping countless with the walls of fire everywhere. After 15 minutes of being hit, Soryu's officers concluded the ship was beyond saving. Captain Ryusaku Yanagimoto gave orders to abandon ship. Men leapt from the deck into the sea, some literally launched by explosions. At first, Akagi seemed like she only had taken a single hit, and was not as badly mauled as her sisters. But that one bomb caused a chain of powerful secondary explosions on her hangar deck. Soon, her fires overpowered the firefighting teams who were trying to drive them back, and then her water mains were cut. Her electrical power cut to the pumps, and Captain Aoki ordered her magazines flooded. But there was no water to flood them. The crews worked with hand pumps, but they could hardly get enough water onto the fires. As Fuchida recalled, firefighting parties wearing gas masks carried cumbersome pieces of equipment and fought the flames courageously. But every induced explosion overhead penetrated the deck below, injuring men and interrupting their desperate efforts. Stepping over fallen comrades, another damage control party would dash in to continue the struggle, only to be mowed down by the next explosion. It was clear Akagi could no longer serve as Nagumo's flagship, but he was reluctant to leave the ship, insisting, "It is not time yet." Rear Admiral Kusaka pressed him. "Sir, most of our ships are still intact. You must command them. Admiral, I will take care of this ship. Please, we implore you, shift your flag to Nagata and resume command of the force." With tears in his eyes, Admiral Nagumo descended by rope from a forward window of the bridge down to the deck. He and Kusaka both got off Akagi at 10:46 a.m., climbing aboard Nagata. Over on Hiryu, Admiral Taimon Yamaguchi and his staff watched in absolute horror as the 3 other carriers burned. Yamaguchi sent a message to the other carriers. "Try to save your carrier." And he received no replies. The realization struck him hard. Hiryu was the sole survivor of the Kido Butai, capable of operations now. The entire hopes of the IJN rested upon them. Yamaguchi elected to toss the kitchen sink as quickly as possible, not even waiting for a full deck load of planes. He was not making the same mistake as Nagumo. Hiryu got up 18 valves into the air without delay. Next to follow were Kate torpedo bombers. If Yamaguchi could take out all 3 of the American carriers, the Midway evasion might continue. A few minutes before 11 a.m., 18 valves and 6 Zeros sped off, led by Lieutenant Michio Kobayashi. No longer after they had taken off, cruiser Chikuma's No. 5 floatplane reported in, "The enemy is in position bearing 70 degrees, distance 90 miles from our fleet's position." As Kobayashi's men flew off, they saw SPDs of Enterprise and 6 Zeros peeled off to attack them. The Zeros were met by a tight formation by the SPDs, who fired back upon them, taking out 2 Zeros and weakening Kobayashi's escort. Task Force 17's radar picked up the incoming Japanese strike at 32 miles bearing 255 degrees. Yorktown's radar managed to gauge they were picking up altitude, confirming them to be dive bombers. Yorktown's fighter direction officer, Lieutenant Commander Oscar Pearson, directed the Wildcats to intercept the enemy at 10,000 feet. Lieutenant Albert McCuskey, the leader of Yorktown's CAP, spotted the invaders at around 7,000 to 8,000 feet. He flew directly into the oncoming enemy formation. With my 6.50 caliber wing guns blazing, I literally sawed my way through the lead division. I didn't use my sight. It was all done at point-blank range. In the ensuing melee, the Americans fired down 7 Vals and damaged others. The 3 out of 4 Zeros escorting them, likewise, were shot down at the cost of just a single Wildcat. Yorktown's anti-aircraft guns began to fire as the survivors made their run at her. 7 Vals got through Yorktown's cap, each coming in at a different direction and peeling off to make steep dives. Yorktown turned hard to port and heeled sharply to starboard. The first Val was hit by flak and exploded into fiery pieces just as it released its bomb. That bomb struck her deck just aft of her island, and the blast decimated the crew of a 1.1-inch anti-aircraft gun mount. The explosion tore a hole into her flight deck, igniting fires all over the hangar deck. The second Val was hit and exploded likewise before releasing its bomb, but this one narrowly missed, exploding near Yorktown's fantail. A third Val roared down at 75 degrees, missing with its bomb just stern of Yorktown. A few seconds later, a three-plane formation known as a chutai came screaming at her starboard side. The first valve missed off her stern. The second, piloted by Iwa Nakazawa, dropped his 250-kilogram bomb near the center of the ship, and it punched a large hole in her flight deck. The third and last valve took a shallower dive at Yorktown's starboard bow and hit her forward elevator. Raging fires erupted on the hangar deck, threatening to ignite her aviation tanks and magazines. But Yorktown's hangar deck was much better fireproofed than that of the IJN Carriers. More importantly, her fueling hoses had been drained and filled with CO2 gas. The first bomb had flooded the bridge and other island spaces with black smoke. Admiral Fletcher and his officers felt compelled to leave their battle stations, and Fletcher even considered transferring his flag, saying, "I can't fight a war from a dead ship." He would indeed make arrangements to transfer over to the cruiser Astoria. Yorktown's boilers cut out. She was dead in the water. Black smoke spewed from a large hole in her flight deck. Tom Cheek saw some of the carnage after climbing the steel ladders onto the flight deck. A bloody splotch on the gray-painted side of the superstructure, and a mass of bloody flesh encased in shredded denim. On the 20mm battery on the catwalk, a gunner's head had been blown off, but his body remained strapped securely into the chair. 600 miles west was Admiral Yamamoto's main body. Yamamoto passed the last few days standing aboard battleship Yamato's spacious bridge. He was suffering from a rather bad stomach ulcer and was quite pale and queasy. The need for radio silence limited his ability to know about the progress of the battle, though confidence remained high aboard his ship. Then at 10:50 a.m., a signal officer handed him a radio message from Rear Admiral Hayoki Abe. "Fires raging aboard Kaga, Soryu, and the Akagi, resulting from attacks by enemy carrier and land-based planes. We plan to have Hiryu engage enemy carriers. We are temporarily withdrawing to the north to assemble our forces." One officer aboard Yamato recalled Yamamoto groaning as he read the message. He handed it back without a single word. He, alongside his fellow officers, were dumbstruck. They fell into despair. The main body was too far away to help, and it lacked air cover. Nonetheless, the force raised its speed to 20 knots, racing east. Yamamoto sent orders to various elements of the IJN as the Aleutian force raced southwards, likewise to help the Kido Butai. The surface fleet with its transports were to dash over to Midway Atoll to bombard it into oblivion. The main body and survivors of the Kido Butai were to force a surface engagement with the US carriers that very night. 5 valves returned to the Hiryu as Admiral Yamaguchi rushed down to speak to the pilots. By 1 p.m., scouting reports confirmed there was not just 2, but 3 American carriers: the Hornet, Yorktown, and the Enterprise. "There are 3 enemy carriers. You got that? The Kambakutai, that being dive bombers, hit one of them, so there are 2 left. Try to hit a new carrier, which was not damaged, if you can, as a priority. If you do that, we can do a 1-to-1 fight." A new strike of Kates carrying Type 97 torpedoes took off with 6-0 escorts led by Joichi Tominaga. Tominaga's aircraft had been shot up pretty bad during the attack on Midway, and he was already leaking fuel from the left wing. He knew that his aircraft would probably never return to land on Hiryu, but he gallantly refused to change planes with any of his subordinates. The 16 aircraft did not have to fly too far. The US fleet had been sighted 90 miles away from Hiryu. Tominaga's group came across the injured Yorktown. Her fires had been brought under control. There was no more columns of smoke. She was making decent speed. Her repair crews had worked miracles, yet again, because for all intents and purposes, she looked uninjured. And that was rather ironic. Because of their superb repair work, Yorktown looked like another carrier to Tominaga's group as they set down upon her. Tominaga radioed, "Sengun Totsugeki Seyo." the order for the 2 groups of 5 torpedo planes to separate and begin their coordinated runs on Yorktown's bows. Yorktown's radar had picked up the invaders before they even came into view. Despite her damages, Yorktown had patched her flight deck holes and was launching aircraft in response. When Tominaga's wave were just 45 miles off, 6 Wildcats were vectoring out to intercept them. Lieutenant Scott McCuskey was one of those Wildcat pilots, and they fired upon the Kates. Meanwhile, Yorktown was launching another 5 more Wildcats. Lieutenant Commander Jimmy Thatch fired his .50 caliber gun, putting several rounds in the left wing of Tominaga's plane, lighting it on fire. Thatch could not help but admire Tominaga's determination. The whole left wing was burning, and I could see the ribs showing through the flames. And that devil still stayed in the air until he got close enough and dropped his torpedo. And that one almost hit Yorktown. He was a dedicated Japanese torpedo plane pilot. Even though he was already shot down, he went ahead and dropped his torpedo. By that time, the whole airplane looked like it was on fire. The top surface of both wings were burned away, everything but the ribs. He must have had some wing surface underneath to hold him up, but he was obviously sinking all the time, and he fell into the water right after he dropped his torpedo. They were excellent in their tactics, and in their determination. Nothing would stop them, if they had anything to say about it. Another Kate was lit on fire but released its torpedo, and then aimed itself directly at Yorktown as guns continued to fire upon her, forcing her to cartwheel into the sea. Yorktown turned sharply first to starboard and then to port. The second group of Kates launched 4 torpedoes at her bow. The planes took heavy fire from Wildcat and anti-aircraft gunners. One Kate, after releasing its torpedo, flew across Yorktown's bow. She was flying so low that the crewmen on the flight deck of Yorktown had made eye contact with the Japanese pilot. As aircraft mechanic Bill Sergey recalled, "I could see the pilot hunkered down in the front. The fellow in the second seat was holding a camera to take pictures of our ship. The third man in the rear seat was not using his gun. He held up his hand, and I thought of stories I had read about chivalry. I thought he was saluting us." 2 of the torpedoes slammed into Yorktown's port side amidship. 2 large explosions rumbled the ship, and the lights cut out as the carrier began to list. The first torpedo took out 3 boilers and killed the engines. The second flooded her forward generator room and cut the power. Emergency diesel generators began to pump up, but soon they all short-circuited. Without any power, the counterflood pumps could not correct her port list. Yorktown found herself listing 30 degrees. It looked like she was going to capsize, and Captain Buckmaster ordered abandoned ship at 3 p.m. to save the crew. Hundreds of her crew stationed below deck had a hellish time trying to escape in the darkness. The grisly remains of the dead were everywhere. Men jumped into dozens of knotted lines and were lowered into the sea. Whaleboats took the wounded. Yorktown fuel tanks had ruptured, sending 4-inch thick layers of oil everywhere. Destroyers came in to pick up and rescue the men. Even with Yorktown out of action, the Americans still had 2 carriers to face off against the Kido Butai's lone Hiryu. The Americans suffered horrifying losses amongst their torpedo bombers, but their dive bombers were pretty much intact. 5 hours of daylight remained, and the Hiryu was still in range, and she still had a few of her planes left. If they could knock out Hiryu, that meant all 4 carriers were lost, and as one officer put it, "If 4 carriers are smashed, their planes are going to have a hell of a time finding a place to land." Enterprise and Hornet were operating independently. Admiral Spruance was preparing 2 deck-load strikes to hit Hiryu, which had been sighted by Yorktown scout bombers at 2:45 p.m., only 110 miles due east. Enterprise began launching her 25 SBDs and 8 Wildcats, led by Lieutenant Gallagher. They would have a 40-minute trip to reach the Hiryu. Hiryu only had 4 Vals, 5 Kates, and an experimental Type 2 dive bomber from Soryu, refueling in her hangar, leaving the ship in a horribly vulnerable position. Lieutenant Gallagher led the wave in a wide circle off to the north, seeing 3 large carriers with fiery decks, and the Hiryu looking much more pristine. He set up his formation in an up-sun approach, hoping to spoil the anti-aircraft gunners. With so many dive bombers, Gallagher judged he did not need all of them to hit the Hiryu, so he directed 15 planes of Yorktown's Bombing 3 to target battleship Haruna. Lookouts aboard Chikuma saw the enemy planes at 5 p.m., and Hiryu tossed hard to port as she fired flak bursts into the sky. Zero fighters swooped in, firing their 20mm cannons at the first SBDs, and in combination with all the flak from the anti-aircraft gunners, the first bombs released all missed. Lieutenant Dewitt Shumway was ordered to hit Haruna, but he saw the first bombers fail in their bomb runs against Hiryu, so he made the quick decision to turn around and put his attack against the carrier instead. The Hiryu was well defended, but with 3 different groups of bombers attacking her, she was overwhelmed. 4 1,000-pound bombs smashed into her flight deck forward, punching through to the hangar decks, starting fires. The forward elevator was blown upward, the electrical power cut out, rooms filled with smoke. Although the Hiryu could still pull 30 knots, the last of the SPDs arrived a bit late, and they knew that she was already a gunner, so they instead attacked Chikuma and the Tone. Meanwhile, believe it or not, over at the task force, Lieutenant Colonel Sweeney's B-17s had just returned from Midway. They refueled, rearmed, and tried to drop bombs on the enemy. And in a extremely typical fashion, they completely missed their targets. But they scared the piss out of the SPDs, who saw the bombs flying all around them. A single glance at Hiryu was enough to know her flight deck was done. The 0 pilots in the air knew they were all marooned. Admiral Yamamoto received Nagumo's report at 5:55 p.m. Hiryu hit by bombs and set afire. 5:30. 4 carriers were ablaze. But still, the Admiral was not yet ready to consider withdrawal. Yamamoto was having a difficult time coming to grips with what had occurred. At 7:15 p.m., Yamamoto sent the order, "The enemy task force has retired to the east. Its carrier strength has practically been destroyed." Yamamoto then ordered the surface ships of Nagumo's Kirobutai to hunt down the American carriers. They would destroy them during a night action, while other parts of the fleet would assault Midway. The main body was still rushing to the scene at 20 knots, hoping to unleash the big guns. Fuchida judged the message to be so strangely optimistic as to suggest that Commander-in-Chief of the combined fleet was deliberately trying to prevent the morale of our forces from collapsing. Firefighting efforts persisted on all 4 carriers, to varying degrees. Doctors did their best to cope with the wounded, often without any medical supplies because, well, the fires had destroyed all of them. Men died of burns, or asphyxiation by toxic fumes. Soryu was the first of the 4 to be abandoned. The order came at 10:45 a.m. Kaga's fires raged out of control until 4:40 p.m., when it was abundantly clear nothing could be done to save her. And Commander Takashiya Amagi ordered all of the survivors into the sea. Akagi's conditions were more manageable, and many labored long to try and save her. Her crews fought valiantly, but at 6 p.m., with the numbers of the dead and wounded multiplying, Captain Aoki concluded she was lost and ordered abandoned ship. By 7 p.m. that evening, in the gathering dusk, Enterprise and Hornet tucked themselves to bed, landing the last of their cap. With the Yorktown abandoned, this led Spruance to radio Fletcher to ask if he had any further orders, to which Fletcher replied, negative, and effectively handed tactical command over to Spruance. Spruance elected to stand off to the east until midnight to keep the Japanese surface units safely at arm's length. In the early morning of June the 5th, they would put themselves under the umbrella of Midway for further protection. It was a controversial decision. Spruance might be failing to pursue the enemy. Kaga and Soryu were torpedoed by Japanese destroyers between 7:15 and 7:30 p.m., while at the same time Captain Aoki of Akagi radioed Nagumo asking for permission to scuttle her as well. That transmission was intercepted by Admiral Yamamoto aboard the Yamato, and he denied the request. Captain Aoki then returned to the Akagi alone, and he lashed himself to an anchor and resigned his fate to be shared with hers. Nagumo had orders to chase down and engage the U.S. carriers, but instead, he simply continued to withdraw northwest, with the still-burning Hiryu in company. Apparently based on some more false scouting reports, he was under the belief there were in fact 4 American carriers heading west towards him. He reported this to Admiral Yamamoto at 9:30 p.m., and that message was received by shock and disgust aboard Yamato's bridge. Yamamoto's staff quickly placed blame on Nagumo for the loss of the carriers, though Nagumo had acted according to the battle plan. Admiral Yamamoto placed Admiral Kondo in tactical command of the pending operation, a humiliation from which Nagumo would never recover. Admiral Kondo was directed to rally all surface ships available, form a battle line, and chase down the American carriers to the east. With any luck, they could pitch a battle by 1 a.m. Nagumo appeared to simply ignore the order, and he kept the remnants of the Kido Butai on a northwesterly course. 2 hours later showed Yamamoto doubting his decision. Hell, it's pretty insane. For example, he ordered the cruisers led by Kirata to bombard Midway without any air cover. That was literally like asking them to be completely annihilated by US Air Forces from Midway or the carriers. By 12:15 p.m. on June the 5th, Yamamoto ordered Kirata to turn his cruisers around and retreat west, and then he instructed the same of Kondo and Nagumo. These orders were a plain declaration of defeat. One of the officers aboard Yamato's bridge was crying and asked what would become of Akagi. No one aboard Yamato knew that Kaga and Soryu had been scuttled already. Captain Kuroshima exclaimed, "We cannot sink the Emperor's warships with the Emperor's own torpedoes." His passionate outcry silenced the entire bridge. Watanabe recalled, "Virtually all members of Yamamoto's staff choked and stopped breathing." Yamamoto, a former skipper of the Akagi, was not unmoved, but there was no other alternative. He quietly replied to allow her to fall into enemy hands was unacceptable, and then he added, "I was once the captain of Akagi, and it is with heartfelt regret that I must order that she be sunk. I will apologize to the Emperor for the sinking of Akagi by our own torpedoes." So at 3:50 a.m., Nagumo was given the order, and he relayed it to the destroyer escorts of Akagi. The torpedo specialist wept at the order, and 4 destroyers fired on the Akagi as many screamed, "Akagi Banzai." She was sunk by 4:55 a.m. The Hiryu had kept pace with the fleet until about 10 p.m. when she went dead in the water. Her fires raged, and by midnight half of the dead had burned away. Shortly after, Captain Tomio Kaku ordered abandon ship, but the process unfolded at a stately ceremonial pace. 800 men assembled amidship and stood to attention as Admiral Yamaguchi gave a speech. At the end of the speech, Admiral Yamaguchi and Captain Kaku resolved to go down with the ship. Several other officers begged to join them, but Yamaguchi ordered them away, declaring, "Young men must leave the ship. This is my order." To Captain Kaku, the Admiral said, "There is such a beautiful moon tonight. Shall we watch it as we sink?" As the other men got off the ship, they waved farewell with their caps. The destroyer Makugumo fired 2 torpedoes at Hiryu and left the scene. Incredibly, Hiryu refused to sink, and on the morning of the 5th, she was still afloat, emitting smoke. She even had dozens of survivors aboard, this including an engine room gang who had made an incredible escape from her lower reaches. By 9 a.m., the ship finally sank, and 34 survivors escaped in a cutter which was later picked up by the Americans. Unfortunately for Admiral Carita's Cruisers Division 7, as they were withdrawing 50 nautical miles from Midway, at 2:15 a.m. on June the 5th, they were spotted by an American submarine named Tambor. Lookouts aboard cruiser Kumano saw the submarine and reported it to the division, starting quite a chaotic scramble. Kumano turned starboard to avoid a torpedo attack, but another cruiser, the Mikuma, turned too sharply and collided into her sister cruiser, Mogami. Both ships weighing 13,000 tons smashed into another at 25 knots. Mogami's bow caved in and folded over towards the port side. Mikuma trailed oil from a ruptured fuel tank, but both ships were able to continue their withdrawal. However, at dawn of June the 5th, a PBY flying patrol spotted the wounded ships and reported it in. Midway sent 6 SBDs, 6 Vindicators, and a squadron of 8 B-17s to go hammer them. Not a single one of these aircraft made a hit, but one of the Vindicators, damaged by anti-aircraft gunfire, crash-dived onto the Mikuma, doing some more damage as she tried to limp away. Task Force 16 stayed close to Midway, just in case of a new Japanese attack, but by 3 p.m., they were sending large waves of aircraft to hunt down any of the survivors. Enterprise and Hornet launched 50 SBDs who spotted the Hiryu sinking, and then the lone Japanese destroyer, the 2,000-ton Tanikaze. The Tanikaze sped off at 30 knots, zigzagging like a snake, to try and avoid a ton of bombing attempts, including 5 more B-17s later that day. On June the 6th, Spruance resolved to make a last all-out attempt to finish off the Mogami and the Mikuma. At dawn, he launched 18 SBDs to perform a long search mission west, and at 6:45 a.m., they discovered the 2 damaged cruisers and their 2 destroyer escorts. With no Zero fighter cap, the SBDs took their sweet time on their dive runs, scoring 5 hits on Mikuma and 2 hits on the Mogami. Mogami was able to escape back to Japan, but she was severely wounded, while Mikuma would sink by dusk of the 6th, taking most of her crew of 888 men down with her. After 2 nights and a day, the abandoned Yorktown drifted and burned. Admiral Fletcher and the remaining units of Task Force 17 had followed Spruance east, but left a lone destroyer, the Hughes, to watch over the crippled carrier. Hughes had been ordered to scuttle her if the Japanese fleet appeared on the horizon, but Fletcher had not given up on the carrier just yet. On the morning of June the 6th, a 170-man salvage team reboarded the blackened carrier and went to work stamping out her fires and restoring power back to the ship. The destroyer Hammond came close to her to provide water, electricity, and foamite. Yorktown was counter-flooded, with water from Hammond's fire hoses, and gradually her list was diminishing. By 1 p.m., the minesweeper Video secured a tow line across Yorktown's bow and began towing her at a speed of about 3 knots. There was suddenly hope for the battle-hardened carrier. Perhaps she could make it back to Pearl Harbor and be repaired. Little did the Americans know, lurking in the sea, attracted by the smoke trail, was the Japanese submarine I-168, commanded by Lieutenant Commander Yahachi Tanabe. Tanabe approached skillfully, sneaking underneath the destroyer screen undetected, and raised his periscope to see the Yorktown being tugged at a snail's pace. At 1:36, I-168 took the shot and fired 4 torpedoes at close range. 1 torpedo slammed right into Hammond, 2 passed under Hammond's keel and detonated against the hull of Yorktown, and the 4th narrowly missed both ships. Hammond's lookout spotted the incoming torpedoes, and her 20mm guns opened up as the alarms went off. The crew of Hammond tried to cut away the cables to Yorktown to get away, but there was simply no time. Hammond's turbine screamed as her port propeller clanged against Yorktown's hull. The impact of the explosion lifted more than 100 sailors off Hammond's decks, flinging men into the sea. Fatefully, Hammond's depth charges were fully charged and armed, and they would detonate when they reached the depths for which they were set. The stern of Hammond sank from the sight, and a few seconds later an entire rack of depth charges exploded, tossing men from their feet on Yorktown. Clarence C. Ray, a communications officer, remembered seeing perhaps 100 heads floating on the water as she went under Most of these were Hammond sailors, who had been catapulted off the destroyer by the initial torpedo strike. Just then, the depth charges all exploded. All of a sudden, heads that had been on the water just before the depth charges exploded suddenly disappeared. Something like a windshield wiper erases the droplets from your windshield when it's raining. They were just all gone. 81 of Hammond's crew of 251 were lost in action. As for the Yorktown, the 2 torpedo hits rocked and rolled her hard as the I-168 made her escape. At first, Yorktown looked alright, as her counterflooding brought her to an even keel. Then salvage teams rushed to secure watertight doors, but the flooding continued, and she was sinking lower into the sea. As dusk approached, the order was given to get off the carrier. By the dawn of the 7th, Yorktown was listing, and she gradually rolled all the way that her flight deck was vertical. Her surviving crew watched her go down aboard the circling destroyers. And so the Battle of Midway was over. 4 Japanese fleet carriers and a heavy cruiser were sunk. Several other cruisers and destroyers were damaged. 292 aircraft were destroyed, and over 3,000 Japanese were dead. The Americans won this incredible victory at the cost of Yorktown and Hammond, both sunk by a single submarine. 145 U.S. aircraft were destroyed, and 307 Americans were dead. Raymond Spruance had performed tremendously. Admiral Nimitz had discovered another valuable American seagoing commander. Nimitz had possessed foreknowledge of the Japanese intentions and arranged his forces in a concentrated manner to ambush and destroy the Japanese carriers. Yamamoto's plan was vast, fatally complex, while Nimitz was straightforward. Luck played a pivotal role in the battle on countless occasions. The Japanese unwillingness to perform piecemeal attacks while the Americans haphazardly did perform them resulted in the convergence of so many aircraft from so many different directions, smashing the Japanese all at once. When Hiryu sent 2 strikes at the Americans, both found Yorktown, although Enterprise and Hornet were well within their striking range. 2 or even 3 U.S. carriers could have easily been sunk. As momentous as it was, the Battle of Midway was not the largest turning point of the Pacific War. The U.S. mobilization would still take 6 months to affect the Pacific theater. The IJN was still the most formidable navy in the Pacific, but the battle was a devastating loss, not just because of the carriers, but also the trained mechanics, crewmen, and pilots. Around 110 carrier aviators had died, about a quarter of the Kido Butai. The surviving veterans were the most valuable asset in Japan's arsenal. The Battle of Midway blunted the tip of the Japanese spear, but it was not broken. As Nagumo's force joined up with the main body on June the 10th, Yamamoto's staff played nice. No blame was shed, for indeed all must have realized that the greatest weight of responsibility for the defeat rested on Yamamoto's shoulders. Yamamoto had acknowledged as much, declaring that the defeat was all his responsibility, and they were not to criticize the Nagumo force. Genda, Onishi, and Kusaka appeared haggard and exhausted. Went aboard the Yamato by Breach's Bowie. Entering Yamamoto's private cabin, Kusaka said, "Admittingly, we are not in a position to come back alive shamelessly after having made such a blunder, but we have come back, only to pay off the score someday. So I beg of you from the bottom of my heart to give us such a chance in the future." Yamamoto replied curtly, "All right." Ugaki tried to ease Kusaka's mind, offering him gifts and even money, and listened for the first time to eyewitness accounts of the demise of their 4 carriers. The 3 men returned to the Nagara that afternoon. I would like to take this time to remind you all that this podcast is only made possible through the efforts of Kings and Generals over at YouTube. So please, go subscribe to Kings and Generals over at YouTube and continue to help us produce this content by checking out www.patreon.com/kingsandgenerals. And if after this entire 2-hour-long episode on the Battle of Midway still has you hungry for some more, please go check out my personal channel, the Pacific War channel over at YouTube, where I have my own episode on the Battle of Midway, and also a specialized episode on Nagumo's dilemma during the Battle of Midway. Give it a look, it'll mean a lot to me. Now I hope you enjoyed that rather long retelling of the Battle of Midway. When Nagumo returned to the main body on June the 10th, Yamamoto's staff played nice. No blame was shed, because all realized the great weight of defeat rested solely upon Yamamoto's shoulders. Yamamoto had acknowledged as much, declaring that the defeat was all his responsibility, and they were not to criticize the Nagumo force. Yamamoto would never again muster naval forces to mount a sustained offensive against any allied territory. Midway made certain the Pacific War was to be a prolonged war of attrition, precisely the sort of war that Yamamoto had warned against.